Hey guys, thanks for joining today's podcast. Today we're going to be talking about backup and disaster recovery. Within that, we're going to be talking about cloud backups and common misconceptions with those. We're also going to be talking about physical and virtual backups for your servers. And then we're going to finish with talking about continuity plans for your applications and networks. So with that, let's get into it. Well, cool. Thanks again for joining us, Stefan and Julio, for this next podcast episode on backup and disaster recovery. So this should be a fun one. And we're going to kind of go over three different areas. One is the cloud, right? And some of the misconceptions about cloud backup and how that changes as you move to the cloud. Then we'll talk a little bit about physical and virtual servers, whether those are sitting, again, in the cloud or in your on-premise environment. And then talk about some other considerations for core applications and continuity plans for that kind of stuff. So let's first start talking about cloud. Right into it, Julio, what are some of the common misconceptions that people get about the cloud? They say, well, I'm in the cloud, so I don't need backup. Is that true?
Yeah, so it really depends. I think one of the problems is that a lot of people think, yeah, I have my data, is accessible via the cloud. I can be anywhere and be able to hop on and just get whatever files I want and stuff. But the problem with that is, yeah, sure, it's available, but that doesn't mean that if you accidentally delete it or if it gets removed by like a nefarious actor or anything like that, that it would be recoverable once it's moved into that deleted state. That's usually something that has to be turned on after the fact or like by your admin.
Right. Yeah, so a lot of these cloud vendors specifically state in their terms of service that the data is your responsibility and they are going to maintain the availability of the data,
right.
But they're not necessarily in all cases going to be backing it up.
Right.
And especially not a third-party backup. So
right.
Things can happen, crazy things sometimes. So there's actually an Australian investment company that managed about $135 billion in Google Workspace, and they deleted their entire tenant. And it was a super anomalous thing, right?
Yeah.
But it can happen.
Right.
And that's a pretty low risk of happening. But what's a lot more plausible is either accidental deletion or a bad actor, right? Getting in and deleting data. So it's really important that even once you move data to a cloud service like a Google Drive or OneDrive or SharePoint, that you still have third-party backups to sleep well at night. So
Yeah, and I think the third-party aspect of it is pretty important because instead of having only one point of recovery, instead of having like one place that you can go and get these files from, you have something that's offset and it's not part of that same ecosystem. And so it's kind of part of like that redundancy aspect, high maturity, organizational structure.
Yeah, and to be honest, I mean, backup is a very good idea. Can you live without a third-party backup? Yes, if you really want to take on that risk. But if you want to reduce the risk and you want to do it the proper way, definitely having a third-party backup is the way to go and is generally the recommendation. And we use that as a standard for all of our clients, for sure, right?
Right.
So, Stefan, there are a few downsides that we've run across when recovering from cloud backups. Talk a little bit about some of the things like that you should consider about that, with recovery speed and that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, of course, if you have your email backups and they're going to a different cloud provider, of course you want to have your backups in a third-party backup because you don't want to keep them in the. For example, if you have your email in the Microsoft emails ecosystem, you don't want to have your backups in the Microsoft ecosystem. You already told us that. But then if you use a third-party tool, you need to consider your recovery speed. For example, if a mailbox gets deleted, how fast do you want your data back? Is it okay that it takes a couple of hours? Or we've had a mailbox like 50 gigabytes and it took us 2 days to get all the data back because of limitations of the backup system. The data was still there and the recovery went quite well, but it just took a long time.
Why does it take a while?
Yeah, because in this specific case, the tool used a specific Microsoft API, and it was throttling all the data being moved from the third party back to Microsoft.
And a lot of this stuff you don't really find out until you start to actually work on it, right? So an API or an integration between Microsoft and the backup provider, they use that integration and Microsoft and many cloud vendors starts to throttle that or slow that down so that only so many items can be replaced per hour. And so when you're looking at like SharePoint data, Google Drive, whatever it might be, you have to consider that the throttling there may be a recovery limitation that you need to be aware of. And probably testing that, right? To do some tests and see how long that will take would be a really good idea, so you have a solid understanding of how long it will actually take. Let's say a company wants to bring their data back on premise, but it resides in the cloud. So I want to back up my OneDrive or my SharePoint on prem. I want to physically have the hard drives. Can I do that? And if so, how?
Yeah, of course, that's an option. For example, Synology has a couple of apps Synology is an on-premises NAS you can use to store data, but it can also retrieve your Microsoft backups. It can back up your email, your SharePoint data, and even on-prem file servers or file shares in Azure. It can back up everything to the Synology. So your data is still in the cloud, but your backups are with you. So you have access to your backups, and you can even keep offline backups by taking backups of the Synology on an external USB drive and keep the USB drives offline, because once a USB drive is disconnected, no one can change the backups anymore.
Yeah. So it gives you that optionality that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the optionality with physical and virtual servers too, and kind of crafting and architecting a backup solution. But it really just gives you more options, but you may still be subjected, or you will be, to those same throttling limitations, even if you're backing it up on premise. You have the comfort of maybe having the disks, right? You're able to access the data, but the recovery speed from on-prem to cloud can still be a throttling limitation. And so something to definitely consider.
You have your upload speed. Maybe you have like 1 gigabit of download speed, but only 10 megabits of upload.
Sure.
And then of course your recovery time will be like terrible.
Yeah, absolutely. So the main thing that we're taking away here with cloud, and we're talking mostly about like cloud storage providers, but there's also infrastructure as a service. So you might be running virtual machines in Azure or AWS or something like that. But those are going to follow, for the most part, the same kind of recovery procedures as a regular physical or virtual machine at your office, with some differences that we'll talk about. But it's a really good idea to be having backups on cloud solutions in general. If you want to sleep well at night, you know that your data all resides in a secondary vendor, and that you have an additional backup option in any of those weird, wonky cases, right? So let's talk a little bit about physical and virtual servers. This could be like a Dell or an HP server at your office. Maybe it's running multiple virtual machines on it. You have some applications, you have files on premise. Stefan, talk to us a little bit about your options for backup. There's the concept of a backup appliance, right? So you have a physical piece of equipment at that location, or you could just take your backup straight to the cloud. Give us a little bit of a rundown on those options there.
Yeah, I think the minimum you should have is, of course, that you back up your physical on-prem servers to the cloud as a minimum. But then, of course, if you back up your physical environment to the cloud and you need recovery, well, then you spin up your virtual machines in the cloud and your latency will be higher. Your apps will be slower. So you might want to consider, if it's important for you or for your business, to have an on-prem appliance. So first, the backups are taken from your physical servers to an appliance next to your server.
Like a dedicated separate server.
A dedicated separate server, yeah, correct. And so if your server goes down, you can just move over to your virtual or your appliance next to your physical server. But then, of course, if something else happens, like a fire in your server room, then everything goes down. So you still have your cloud backup, because your physical server copies your backups to the appliance, and appliance copies them to the cloud.
So it goes to the concept of like the options, right? It gives you more options, potentially much better speeds if you do need to have a failover and a failback occur. And so it's more of a nice to have. It's definitely required that your data is getting backed up outside of your office location. That is really an imperative thing at this point. But having the dedicated appliance on premise just gives you more options. It can even speed up recovery just a little bit faster. If you do need to fail over to that backup appliance, your speed to access, you might not even know a difference, right? So it's a real, not sort of like a luxury, I wouldn't say, but it's just an even higher maturity solution to have that optionality there on premise. And so, with both cloud and on-premise backups, there's these concepts of RPO and RTO, recovery point objectives, recovery time objectives. Julio, talk a little bit about what's a recovery point first.
So a recovery point would be like the frequency of when you are recovering that data set.
Yeah.
So when in that point in time, is it snapshotting or is it grabbing that backup? Whereas the difference between that would be the RTO.
Well, yeah. Let's expand a little bit on the recovery point. So the frequency, right? Are you taking backups every day? Are you taking backups twice a day?
Right.
Are you taking backups every hour or every 10 minutes? So,
and that's going to vary between your organizational needs.
Right.
'Cause some places are going to be okay with, we only need a backup once a day.
Yep.
And that's fine.
What does that mean though? So like if you only have one backup and something happens today,
right,
you're gonna lose an entire day's work.
Yeah.
And so while some companies may be okay with losing an entire day, a lot of times people, if you tell them that, it's kind of like, we probably prefer to maybe just lose a couple hours at most.
Right.
And so trying to get that recovery point or that frequency down to say every hour or two is really ideal, right? For most small businesses that have a reliance on those things.
Right.
So that's the frequency. Talk a little bit about recovery time.
Yeah, recovery time objective basically stands for how long is it going to take you to be able to grab your backup and put it back into production.
Right.
How long are you going to be down essentially before you can go back to normal
that
operations?
recovery point.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, one thing that we see a lot of times is companies will be a little bit overzealous on their RTO, their recovery time. They say, well, we're taking these snapshots, everything like that. We should be able to have you back up in just a couple hours. But a lot of times they're not really testing that. And so they go to actually do a recovery of a server or whatever it may be. And all of a sudden, the recovery is taking a day. It's taking 2 days. And it was a lot longer than they thought.
Yeah.
So making sure that your backup solution, your BCDR, business continuity and disaster recovery, is actually mature and actually brings that recovery time way down. One good example is a lot of providers are using something like Veeam. Veeam is where you have to roll your own console, your own application. You have to manage a lot of those pieces on your own. And so something like that, it could be a lot more difficult to manage Veeam very, very well versus a turnkey solution. So a lot of these turnkey solutions, it's like a few button presses and now you have the server, it's booting up, it's ready to go. And it really keeps everything nice and consistent and make sure that you can actually recover those servers in a lot less time.
Right.
Couple example of these, like with a proper turnkey solution, direct to cloud or with an appliance can vary a little bit of like what these realistically are. But a lot of times with a very mature solution, it's not crazy to have a recovery time of like 30 minutes or an hour to say, yep, we just need to spin up the copy. It's going to be spun up and then we need to do some networking and you're going to be operating just like nothing happened with that original server. Right. So definitely like looking at these recovery points, recovery time, and understanding what they are and being on the same page with your service provider is like really important to make sure that you have that ironed out. In addition to that plan, there's things that we need to be doing with the backups, right? Testing. We need to actually test the plan. So talk to me a little bit about like snapshot verification and manual testing. What does that look like? How do you test the backups to make sure they actually work?
Yeah, actually a very mature backup solution will probably send you a daily snapshot or a screenshot of the server that's actually booted in their lab environment.
Automatically, right?
Automatically.
They have some automation. It'll boot the snapshot or the latest point of the day, and it'll take a quick screenshot of the login page, and you'll see the date and the time, and you'll feel comfortable the server can actually boot from recovery.
Yeah, so you know that your server will actually boot. However, you still need to test your apps. So once in a while, like a quarterly test or maybe a monthly test, you need to actually boot your backups in a lab environment, sign into them and see if all your apps or your services are starting and if everything still works, because there might be some sort of a software issue. Because if there's a software issue on your original server crashes, your backup might not boot because the issue was already there. So you need to do manual testing of your backups, and not only to test if your software is working, but also if your process of recovery is all right, if it works.
Yeah, and this is something that we see frequently. Like we talked about recovery points, recovery time objectives, different solutions that IT providers are using. Many times they're going years without testing because they don't have the process in place. So they're not opening that quarterly ticket reoccurring to go in and check, because the tooling that they're using is really clunky and it costs them a lot of time to go spin these up. So we're using these solutions that are very mature and allow you to do these tests in 15 to 30 minutes. And so we're able to actually do that testing for our customers, because the last thing you want to have happen is you have an incident and your service provider hasn't tested the backups for like 2 or 3 years. And guess what? They come back to you and they say, we can't get the recovery point to boot because we didn't test it and we didn't think it was going to fail.
We need to do a manual recovery.
Yes.
We need to go into the servers.
And it's going to take days
files.
if we can even get it back. And now you're going to lose X amount of time. It's not going to be a day. It's going to be more than that potentially. So the testing is really, really important. And outside of just testing, right? So you have the automated snapshot verification or like automated boot testing. You have the quarterly or monthly test to actually confirm manually that you can even access all the data and apps. What's another protection that we can use, such as an air gap? Like, talk to me a little bit about what's an air gap.
Yeah, air gaps. So the easiest way to think about it, and I'll lay it out like in a physical way, so that then we can translate it over to the virtual cloud way, right? It's so air gap is basically you do your backup, load it up into a flash drive, grab that flash drive and put it into a safe. Right. No one can touch it. It's protected. It's away.
And it's disconnected from any system.
Exactly.
Internet,
network.
network.
Nothing can write to it. Nothing can delete it. Nothing can reach it, essentially. So same concept, but except with your cloud data, it gets moved over. That data set gets segregated over so that anyone from the console, anyone that isn't basically that service provider, can't read, can't write, can't do anything to it.
Maybe even the service provider too.
Yeah, you have to go
with
through
a lot of solutions, the air gap will prevent anyone from touching it.
Right, and you would have to go. So if you do want to grab it or put it back into production or whatever it is that you want to do with it, you would have to go through a vetting process.
Yeah, open a ticket,
which would take time.
Hey, we have an incident. You need to confirm everything. But it gives you that day, it gives you that week or whatever the period of air gap is to say, the bad actor, somebody got in, they started trying to purge backups. If you don't have that air gap, like you said, from a console, like a Veeam or something, let's say you still have the cloud provider, a lot of times a bad actor will go in there and delete the cloud backups. Right. And if you don't have the air gap, now your cloud backup's gone and you're on-prem.
Yeah.
And so that's really bad, right? Because now you think that you have backups, but they've purged them out. And then they take their actions, ransomware, whatever else, and then now you have no options. So
yeah, it's basically a way to kind of double and make sure that you'll be good in the event of something like that happening.
Yeah. So air gap is also a critical part of any mature backup solution, because once that backup copy hits the cloud, you want to know that there is the secondary replication of that can't be touched, because then you generally are much better off. Now, there is a concept, bad actors are also trying to sort of purge good backups to even spoil the air gap copy too. And so that's also a problem that kind of goes on as well. But generally, it's sort of one of the best things that you can do is at least to have that air gap. So definitely having that as well is super key. So yeah, that's really the basics of your backup and disaster recovery plan. I think one thing that we could probably talk about a little bit, Stefan, is like, clients will frequently ask us, well, in a recovery scenario, do you always just recover the entire server, or sometimes do you just recover a part of it? Like a particular database or just some set of the data? How do you determine whether you restore just a little bit of the server or all of it?
Yeah, well, recovering from a backup should be a last resort because, for example, you deleted a file from SharePoint. of course, you shouldn't go into your backup first. First, you go into your recycle bin, then into your admin recycle bin, and then you look into other options to recover a file. And then you go into your backup to recover the file. So it's a last resort. But if someone deleted the whole SharePoint site, like 1 terabyte of data, you can probably still go into the SharePoint admin site and recover the whole site. But in some cases, you might have to revert to your backup. For example, if there's so many... Well, we had an incident a while ago with a mailbox that was fully deleted. And the recovery in Exchange Online only had like 20,000 items. So in this case, we reverted to an external third-party backup solution and recovered the whole mailbox because it was much more than 20,000 items. But it should be a last resort.
What about, so that talks a little bit about some of the cloud stuff. What about on-premise? So you have a line of business program, an estimating tool, right? And one estimate got deleted. It's gone. How can we approach that? Because like, what if other people are making estimates in the program? How do you determine, okay, well, I'm not gonna restore the entire server. I need to get that chunk back. What are a couple techniques that we could do something like that?
Yeah, that's an interesting one because if you restore a database, of course, even if it's a single database, all other changes made by other people, well, they're being recovered as well. So you'll go back in time. So what you could do is restore the database to a different database or maybe into a lab and recover that specific data and then copy it back into your production environment.
One example of this that we used for an HVAC company recently that was really cool is they had a customer for like 15 years with all the notes in the program and they accidentally deleted the note. And we had a really solid idea to get them their note back in like 15 minutes. We used our turnkey backup and disaster recovery solution. We spun up a virtual instance of the server. We went into the software and we were able to recover the note manually by hand. And in that case, we didn't have to do any recovery of the database or the server at large. We just did a point in time restore in a lab, pulled the note out of the application and put it back. And it's sort of manual, but it was so quick and it got to the exact need of the customer right away. And so you can do really cool stuff like that.
Not just quick, but it also provided low impact to front-facing users.
No impact because we didn't recover the database. Right. We didn't do any of that. Like, so there's series of like time commitments to make a recovery. So, you know, obviously recovering the entire server, like we talked about, can be pretty quick because we can just revert it. But then the customer may not want to revert the entire thing. Like there could be other changes. They don't want to lose those changes. So then the next step would be, okay, do we need to recover the entire database behind the program? And that could be timely because we have to extract it, put it back in, like link everything up. And that could almost take more time than just recovering the entire server. But that's where these solutions for recovery can be awesome because you could just boot up that point in time, grab, like literally go into the application and sign in and grab that note field because that's all the customer needed. They said, well, I lost this note for this customer. So I thought that was a really, really cool thing that we were able to do because we got this critical piece of information back within 15 minutes with no impact to other users, no data loss. So those are just some kind of exciting pieces of backup. But I think in closing, you know, one thing that the companies also need to be aware of is that just your servers, right, and your cloud data, your applications, your data, databases, et cetera, are not the only thing to really consider. More and more companies are moving towards vendor-hosted solutions where they're dealing with all the similar things, right? They're dealing with databases, they're dealing with files, they're dealing with your apps. They haven't like ported them over to a web app, so they're still running on Windows Server and different things like that. And so these continuity plans start to reside with the vendor. And that is in their domain, and now they're fully responsible for backup and disaster recovery as well as security. And so depending on how business critical that app is, you need to press that vendor to say, what is your continuity and disaster recovery plan? Yeah. How long will I be down in a certain outage? And start to plan around that. So like, for example, with phone systems, if your business is really dependent on your phones, do you have some sort of failover phone solution that you can switch over to quickly to still receive calls? What about your ERP program? You know, some applications, there's probably not going to be a fantastic immediate failover solution, but you should be writing up these plans to say, if my phones go down, or if my ticketing goes down, or if my remote access, or whatever, that's kind of for our line of business. But for your line of business, you know, with your different programs, how long can you be tolerant to downtime?
Yeah.
What is the vendor promising you for that? Both from an availability and a security standpoint. And do you have any alternative things that you could kind of put in place to keep you propped up if they had a multi-day outage or something like that? You know, how will your business continue to operate and serve your customers if that happens? So
yeah, I think it's just best practice to have something like that in place, because even if it isn't specific like disaster recovery or data recovery, right? I think we just had an incident where one of our clients, they had an outage because of their ISP.
right.
And we had an LTE backup in place for that. And so just having a set plan for that with a backup is kind of important, because you don't really plan for these things. You don't think it's going to not work,
Yeah,
right?
you're touching on, like, backup and disaster recovery doesn't always mean applications, databases, and files. It means internet. It means firewalls. Like, there are backup solutions for routers,
Right.
and different things like that. So how resilient is your network, right? How tolerant are you to having your network go down? Are you going to send everybody home? Do you have the ability to work from anywhere through modern policies and things like that? And so, yeah, absolutely. This extends to many different areas, including internet, having failover there. And we've even had customers that have multiple routers, right? So they have multiple internet connections.
Right. Yeah.
They have multiple battery backups.
Yeah.
They have multiple switches.
Yeah.
Because they want their network to just be up. It needs to always be up. So yeah, you present a really good thing there. Really, anything that is technology related should have some sort of backup plan. Even if the plan is to acknowledge there is no plan, it's just going to be waiting, right? Sometimes that may be the case, because there isn't some easy turnkey thing to just switch your whole enterprise resource planning in one day, right?
Right.
So you might just have to wait.
Yeah.
But you should at least be aware of that, and all of your leadership team should be on the same page that should that day come, that is the plan, is to wait.
Yeah. And which is valid in some instances, because like we said earlier, some businesses are going to be more lenient with, okay, we can be down for this long.
Right.
Because we're not going to lose X amount or whatever it is. But other businesses need to be like on it. They only have 1 hour of downtime maximum.
Yeah, so look at Southwest, right?
Right.
Southwest Airlines, crew scheduling app goes down. It's really old. They didn't invest enough in their technology. And so they thought they were good. It went down. They couldn't even operate. They had no continuity or disaster plan, because the scheduling app was the only way they operated. And as soon as that went down, they can't operate. They can't schedule people. They don't even know where people are at.
Yeah.
So the airplane stopped flying.
Yeah.
And like we said, sometimes that is the case, because there just can't really easily be a plan, but maybe there can be. So it's something to really think through and make sure that you are aware of those gaps and of your plan for each area.
And your plan doesn't need to have a full-blown solution. For example, if your phone system goes down, maybe it's enough to just forward all your phones to one cell phone.
Sure. Depending on the scale of the business, that could work. But if you're getting 1,000 calls a day, it probably is not going to work, right? So a lot of these things do scale with criticality, with user impact, with cost of downtime, and that sort of thing, right? You know, if you have 10 people down versus 10,000 people down, there's a very big difference in cost there. So with that, yeah, I think that really gives hopefully the viewer a good understanding of cloud, physical, virtual server backups, other considerations for like their business applications and other things like internet, right? And networks. So yeah, really appreciate the discussion today, guys. And hopefully you got something out of this. So thanks so much, and see you on the next one.